All right, so oil prices easing up from the triple digits we saw yesterday. That, of course, was a 4-year high. I haven't seen those numbers since Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. Brent crude 93.73. West Texas also down as well. RBOB gasoline, your benchmark for fuel prices over in the United States at $2.74. That was over $3 yesterday. Your European gas futures, Dutch TTF, 55 euros 86. That also up by approximately 5 percentage points, of course, with Qatar cutting off liquefied natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz. So prices are down, but what about the future? What about planning for what comes next? We're going to kick this off with our guest, but we want you to take a listen to comments from President Donald Trump yesterday. His Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said, well, things are just starting. Meanwhile, Trump says we can bring things to an end and declare victory. A reporter asked him about that. Take a listen to his answer.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. President, you've said the war is, quote, very complete, but your defense secretary says this is just the beginning. So which is it, and how long should Americans be prepared
Well, I think
for
you could
this war
say
to last
both.
for?
It's the beginning. It's the beginning of building a new country, but they have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no anti-aircraft equipment. It's all been blown up. They have no radar, they have no telecommunications, and they have no leadership. It's all gone. So, you could look at that statement. We could call it a tremendous success right now as we leave here. I could call it, or we could go further, and we're going to go further. But
all right, let's head to Riyadh, which, of course, has been a flashpoint in this war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Dr. Chinnan Dikwal is the vice chair of the African Energy Council. Joins us from Riyadh. Doctor, I think the first off is to ask you if you're safe and how things are in your environment before we kick off with what President Trump said. How are you holding up?
Wrote this much calmer for now, but I've got to say the events of last week, as it were extremely traumatizing and difficult, but a lot calmer at the moment. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. So good to hear that you're safe. So what do you make of President Trump's comments in terms of trying to gauge where things go, moving forward?
So I think, Rotis, like you and many people, I think what's very clear is this is a war that is still in need of a strategy. It's a war still looking for a strategy. There's lots of inconsistencies between what Donald Trump is saying and some of the officials of the administration. But I'd say this very clearly, Rotis. The reality of it is the Iranians know that they cannot win this war militarily. Okay, that's very clear. They cannot win this war militarily. What they are banking on is winning politically, and I'll explain. Now, politically here being, they fully understand the geography of the war when it first started was squarely in the perimeters of Iran. They have expanded that scope of the war, the geography. They touched a lot of the Arab neighbors, which is what we're talking about. Very unfortunate, touched a lot of neighbors here, trying to expand the perimeter of the war and put pressure on President Donald Trump. And then secondly, they went for the choke point, Strait of Hormuz. Anyone in any part of the globe, if you are today, you'd be feeling the pinch of the oil price. So one, they expanded the perimeter of the war. Number two, they expanded it to everybody in the globe because everyone's going to buy PMS or buy a good or service in a store. Okay, so they've done that. All of those have put pressure on the president. And some of the inconsistencies you're hearing right now are part of that. The markets are screaming. The partners are screaming. The friends, the neighbors, everyone is screaming and they want to bring this to an end. And that is the strategy that they are deploying. And I've got to say this as well. These midterm elections coming. It's a very vulnerable president. So he's thinking very clearly what to do. The markets are reacting. The energy system is falling apart. It's something he has to move very quickly on.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that explanation. So speaking of this choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Aramco just released their earnings for Q4 2025 full year. We saw them, lower profits in double digits, right? And the key thing, though, is when on the earnings call, the CEO talked about the East-West pipeline and trying to, divert oil supplies from the Strait of Hormuz over to the Red Sea, I guess. What do you make of that strategy in terms of, I guess, how effective that could be?
So I'll answer it this way. I think it is really powerful that the Saudis are thinking this way. And just for context, just so I roll this into context, this pipeline was built, I think, in the 1980s when Iran and Iraq were at war. Okay, Iran and Iraq were at war at the particular time, and the Saudis realized that the war could spill into blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm talking 30 years, 40 years ago. Okay, so they built this pipeline. The pipeline can take, there are two pipelines actually. They can take, I think, a total of approximately 5 to 7 million barrels of crude oil a day. And all the time this pipeline has been operating, it runs from one coast, like you're showing there, one coast of Saudi Arabia, all through the Arabic Peninsula into the Red Sea. So it completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. So to your point, 150%. Saudi Arabia is now using that pipeline again to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, where we're seeing a huge blockade at the moment. So the crude oil can still get to market. Do not forget, they produce currently approximately 12 million barrels of crude oil a day. This here can take approximately 5 to 7. So it's a huge amount of crude oil that they can get to market and bypass the Strait of Hormuz. So from a strategic standpoint, a really, really clever strategy of crude oil evacuation.
Now, with respect to, you talked earlier in your first answer about how everyone is being impacted, feeling the pinch of higher prices, and countries are reacting. South Korea in particular, they had a cabinet meeting yesterday, and they are planning on capping fuel prices. Now, they made this decision when oil was at 116, heading to 120. It's now fallen below 100. What do you make of it? Do you think they moved too fast, or they're being proactive? What do you make of it? And these are subsidies. We're essentially talking about fuel subsidies in South Korea. What do you make of the decision there?
Absolutely, Rose. I would answer that question. Can I just add to my last answer, actually? Yeah. Yes, Saudi Arabia might evacuate to the Red Sea, but do not forget the Houthis are also just right next door in Yemen. And we have seen what's happened before. Now, so far in this whole conflict, we haven't seen that dimension where the Houthis have gotten up, to create some issues there. We're hoping that that doesn't happen. But if the Houthis get up and start to cause problems, then again, I think that could be extremely difficult. Now, to your point there, so you're 100% right. We got that from the president of South Korea. He made an announcement to say that, they would cap energy prices, oil and gas prices, so it doesn't go above a certain level. Now, that's very clearly some sort of a subsidy, very similar to what we used to have before. In the past, in Nigeria, even if the oil price went to 120, the ordinary man on the street will be buying it for a price that's sort of flat, okay? So they're thinking about doing that, but 100%. If you ask me, it was a bit too quickly because we have seen from $120, $119 per barrel. In fact, just before I came on, it's about $89 per barrel. So the whole of that premium has come off already, and he's made that announcement. And he put, I think, 100 trillion won, into a fund to make sure that, they have those steady prices. So it was a bit too quick for me, if you ask me. But I'll say this as well, Lotus. He's not the only one who was reacting that way. You'd have seen yesterday that the G7 countries, so we're talking US, UK, Canada, Italy, France, Germany, all of them came together and they were going to activate the strategic petroleum reserves. Now, for context, the strategic petroleum reserves are something that is operated by the IEA, the International Energy Agency. And what happens there is any period where there is emergency when it comes to crude oil, they're able to release a huge amount of reserves onto the market for it to manage price. We saw that in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Joe Biden at the time, I think they released about 250 million barrels onto the market and it stabilized prices. We've seen that in several parts, several times during the, in the last couple of years, even during the Gulf War in 1991. So the G7 countries came together. They wanted to do that, but I think in the meeting, they took a step back because they analyzed that there's still a lot of variables at play and they decided not to do that. Not just that, you also saw the same from Vietnam. Vietnam also wore the same hat, but in that case, slightly different. Any imports into Vietnam, they would take off all of the taxes and the levies so that price can still remain quite low. So there are several strategies that people are deploying here and there, but the key thing here is you've got to do it at the right time. You have to make sure that you don't jump the gun like South Korea has.
Dr. Dikwal, my final question to you is, do you have any estimate for when you think this conflict might end? Because everyone, there's just so much uncertainty in the air. How long do you think this could? Do you think this should, go on for much longer, or could end sooner based on Trump's comments?
Rotis, you recognize the vulnerability here for me. Sat in the Middle East. I just hope that this thing can be resolved in a very short space of time so that life can get back to normal. But it's very difficult for anybody to put a finger on the pulse as to when this could come to an end. I think Donald Trump, you can see the messaging there. I think there's a huge amount of pressure, and we're hoping that some sort of a resolution can come about fairly quickly. But honestly, very difficult for me to put the time frame on the conflict.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dikwal. We hope you stay safe over there in Riyadh. Dr. Chinnan Dikwal, of course, Vice Chair of the African Energy Council. Thank you so much for your time.